The chill of a New York autumn morning wrapped JFK's Terminal 4, where every polished floor tile seemed to reflect both status and judgment. Sunlight spilled through the floor-to-ceiling glass, casting long diagonal shadows across the concourse, while the muffled roar of jet engines seeped in from the runways. The air smelled faintly of strong coffee from the kiosk, by the escalators, and that unmistakable tang of jet fuel lingering from the tarmac beyond. Naomi Brooks stepped through the sliding glass doors from the curbside drop-off, the automatic warmth of the terminal embracing her in an instant. She moved without rush, her hood drawn halfway over her head, the gray fabric soft from years of wear. Black track pants and well-loved sneakers carried her easily across the polished floor. Slung over her right shoulder, a black nylon backpack bounced lightly with each step, its only decoration a small keychain from a tech conference held a decade ago, something no one but her would recognize as the start of her empire. She walked like someone who belonged here, though few watching would have guessed it. Her dark eyes swept across the terminal in quiet appreciation. She knew every moving part of this place, the coded pings of scanners at check-in counters, the scrolling flight boards, the steady ballet of ground crew on the apron. This was her orchestra, her system, though she'd chosen today to attend incognito. She wasn't here as the architect of the logistics platform that kept Terminal 4 humming. She was simply a traveler, heading to Zurich for a meeting that could secure the next chapter of her company's growth. A boarding pass, first class, sat ready on her phone. She hadn't bought it for comfort. It was necessity. The Zurich meeting began at 9 a.m. local time tomorrow, and a sleepless night in coach could dull the sharpness she needed. Across the terminal, Captain Robert Bob Hensley was finishing his pre-boarding routine. 30 years in uniform had given him a stride of ownership, as though the terminal belonged to him as much as the cockpit. His navy blazer was pressed to perfection, silver captain's wings gleaming under the artificial light. The hair above his temple was steel gray, combed with precision, and his jawline carried the firmness of a man used to being obeyed. Bob liked to arrive early enough to survey his gait, to read the crowd the way a seasoned rancher might study a herd. He believed he could tell a great deal about people by the way they dressed, carried themselves, or met his eyes. The well-tailored business traveler? A premium passenger? The parent with sticky-fingered children and a pile of carry-ons? A chaos risk? And then there were the ones in worn hoodies and sneakers, people who, in his mind, were perpetually one misstep away from trouble. Naomi moved past a newsstand, pausing just long enough to glance at the headline on a business magazine. Aerospace Logistics Enters New Era. She smiled faintly and kept walking. Few here knew that she'd been one of the principal forces behind that new era. She found an empty seat a few rows from Gate B-23, away from the main cluster of travelers. From there, she could see the boarding desk, the wide glass view of the jet bridge, and beyond it, the aircraft itself waiting patiently on the tarmac. Linda Myers, the gate agent for today's flight, stood behind the counter, headset tucked neatly around her blonde hair. She moved efficiently, scanning early bird passengers' documents for pre-boarding categories: military, travelers with disabilities, families with small children. Between passengers, she adjusted the gate display, tapping the keyboard with a practiced rhythm. Years in customer service had taught Linda how to smile through almost anything. Tight connections, missing bags, even the occasional rudeness from stressed travelers. The concourse hummed with the rhythm of an international gateway. Announcements in multiple languages, rolling suitcase wheels ticking against tile, snippets of hurried goodbyes. Naomi allowed herself a moment to watch the ground crew outside. From her vantage point, she could see them load luggage into the belly of the plane, scanning barcodes with devices running her software. The efficiency pleased her. The system was doing exactly what it was built to do. First-class boarding for Orion Atlantic Flight 218 to Zurich will begin shortly at Gate B-23, came Linda's voice over the microphone. Naomi rose, slinging her backpack more securely onto her shoulder. She joined the short first-class line, placing herself behind a man in a navy suit carrying a leather briefcase. The man offered Linda a quick smile as she scanned his boarding pass, returning it with a cheerful, "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Carlyle." When Naomi stepped forward, Linda's smile faltered just slightly. It was subtle, enough that most passengers wouldn't have noticed, but Naomi saw the shift in her eyes. Linda took the phone from Naomi's hand and scanned the glowing QR code. The reader chirped its affirmation. Brooks, Naomi. Seat 2A, first class. Still, Linda hesitated, glancing from the screen to Naomi and then back again. It wasn't the data in front of her that caused the pause. It was the picture her mind had already painted, based on the hoodie, the sneakers, the lack of obvious markers of wealth. Naomi stood patiently, her expression neutral. The murmur of boarding passengers drifted behind her. From across the gate area, Bob Hensley had just stepped back into view, his captain's hat tucked under one arm. His eyes moved over the line until they caught on the incongruity. A young woman in casual clothes standing in the first-class lane. He slowed his pace, watching as Linda's body language stiffened. Linda cleared her throat. "Just a moment," she said, her tone edging from friendly to procedural. Her hand hovered over the keyboard, not moving to clear the boarding scan. She glanced again at Naomi, as if something about her presence in this line needed reconfirming. Naomi met her gaze calmly, one eyebrow barely lifting. Around them, the boarding area carried on, oblivious for now. But across the carpet, Bob had already begun to close the distance. Bob's polished shoes clicked across the gate carpet as he closed in, his eyes locked on Naomi like she'd wandered into the wrong neighborhood. The soft thud of his steps seemed louder than the announcements overhead, louder than the wheels of rolling suitcases and the hiss of the jet bridge as it pressurized. Even before he spoke, the air around the first-class lane tightened, the way a room changes when someone used to being obeyed arrives and assumes it will be so again. Linda Myers felt the shift too. She kept her smile on, the professional one, but her fingers hovered above the keyboard instead of completing the boarding. She had scanned thousands of passes in her career and could read a screen at a glance. The green check, the seat assignment, the fare class, the notation that this was a paid first-class ticket, no upgrade, no standby. Everything was in order, and yet she looked up at the gray hoodie, the backpack with the old conference keychain, the face that held calm rather than apology. Her training said proceed. Her nerves, under the weight of an approaching captain, said wait. "Ma'am," Bob said, not unkindly, but without warmth. He set his hat on the counter with the practiced care of ritual. "May I see your boarding pass and passport again?" Naomi offered the phone and passport without hesitation. Her posture didn't change. She didn't try to ingratiate herself or explain. She didn't fill the silence with the sort of chatter that nervous people do. She simply let the documents do their work. Linda's scanner chirped the same bright confirmation as before. "Brooks, Naomi, seat 2A, she read aloud, as if the sound of it could steady the room. "Uh-huh." Bob didn't glance at the screen. He looked at Naomi instead, taking her in as a series of cues he believed he knew how to interpret. "And where are you headed today?" "Zurich," Naomi said. "For business or pleasure?" "Business. What kind of business?" He let the question roll out like a fishing line, easy and casual on the surface. Naomi met his eyes. "I don't believe I need to discuss that at the gate." A couple in their 50s, standing a few paces back in the first-class queue, exchanged a quick look. Behind them, a teenager with headphones pulled one ear cup off, sensing the crackle of a moment. A few steps away, a man in a tweed sport coat, Patrick Lawson, had paused mid-scroll on his phone. He didn't raise the camera, not yet. He watched. Bob nodded, as though he'd expected pushback. "You'll have to excuse me," he said, turning his body just enough to place himself between Naomi and the scanner. "We maintain a certain standard up front. We've had issues with, let's just say, people finding their way into the wrong cabin." Linda swallowed. "Captain, her ticket is—" "I'll take it from here, Linda." The words were automatic. He didn't mean to be harsh. It was simply the rhythm of hierarchy. He rested his fingertips on the counter, a picture of composure. "Ma'am, security protocols are for everyone's safety. I'm sure you understand." Naomi's voice stayed gentle. "My seat is 2A. You have everything you need to verify that." "Sometimes the system gets it wrong." Bob smiled, the kind of smile that suggests a favor is being done to you whether you want it or not. "Sometimes there are errors. Sometimes there are exceptions." Linda's gaze flicked to Naomi's pass again. No upgrade, no buddy pass, no exceptions, clean as a whistle. She felt the old conflict rise, that tug-of-war between rules and the unwritten customs of deference. She'd seen captains use their status like a key to unlock compliance in sticky situations. Overhead bins, seat swaps, a passenger who'd had one drink too many. But this wasn't sticky. This was straightforward. "Captain," she tried once more, softer this time. "The system is clear." Bob didn't look at her. "What's in the backpack?" he asked Naomi. "A laptop," Naomi said, "and a presentation I would prefer to read on the plane." "Anything else?" "Essentials." "And where did you purchase your ticket?" he asked, as if tickets purchased in certain ways belonged to one kind of traveler and tickets purchased in others belonged to another. "Online," she said. He nodded, satisfied. And then, in that way that a man who has long confused comfort with correctness often does, he reached for authority as if it were a coat on a hook. "We're not moving forward until I'm satisfied," he said. "I don't want problems up front." There was a mutter from somewhere in the line, not loud, not confrontational, just the small sound people make when they recognize rudeness covered in policy language. Patrick shifted his weight, thumb hovering over the record button. He had the sense of a lawyer's nose for trouble. The phrasing, the stance, the way the captain's body now blocked an honest transaction. Naomi didn't raise her voice. "You are not the security team," she said. "You're a pilot. Your job is to fly." "You'll find," Bob answered, "that the captain's authority is very broad." "Broad," Naomi said, "is not the same as boundless." The rhythm of the concourse continued around them. Final calls for flights to Miami and Los Angeles, the hiss of an espresso machine, the soft beep of a child's toy somewhere behind the stanchions. But a bubble had formed at B-23, and the people inside it were listening now with the collective attentiveness of a church before a sermon. Linda's fingers, pale at the knuckles from tension, tapped the counter twice and then were still. "Look," Bob said, lowering his tone to something like patience. "We've had people loiter in the first-class lane before. Sometimes it's a misunderstanding, sometimes it's intentional. We can sort this out without making a scene." "I'm not making a scene," Naomi said. "I'm boarding." Bob gestured lightly toward her clothes, a small sweep of the hand that meant nothing and everything. "We have standards," he said, and the words were out before he could hear how they sounded. Something in Linda's shoulders dropped, the way a person's posture does when a line has been crossed in a public way. Patrick's thumb pressed the record circle. The red light winked on. "Captain," Linda said. Careful now, like someone carrying a full cup across a crowded room. "I do need to continue boarding. We have a departure time. Miss Brooks is cleared." "For coach?" Bob asked. "For first," Linda said. 2A. Bob shifted, planting his feet. The physicality of it mattered. What people would later remember wasn't the precise exchange of words, but the feeling of a barrier that shouldn't have been there. Several heads turned. A little girl peeking from a stroller asked her mother, "Why can't the lady get on?" Her mother shushed her gently. Naomi breathed in, slow and even. She could feel the familiar pull of two instincts, one that wanted to comply, to avoid trouble the way so many people learn to for their own safety, and one that refused to validate a fiction. She chose the latter. "My seat is 2A, she said again. It wasn't stubbornness, it was simple fact. Bob angled his body closer, voice pitched just enough to carry. "Not on my plane." The words landed. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. They carried the weight of all the times someone had mistaken personal preference for policy and prejudice for professional judgment. A man in a charcoal suit 2 places back in line cleared his throat as if to speak, then thought better of it. A young flight attendant at the edge of the jet bridge, just off a commute leg, looked up and frowned, recognizing the stance, the tone. She didn't step in. It wasn't her place, and yet it gnawed at her. Linda's eyes begged for an exit ramp that wasn't coming. "Captain, we're tight on time," she said. "If we hold first class, we hold the whole flight." "Then we hold," Bob said. "We're not compromising standards." A TSA officer ambled by on routine patrol, glanced at the scene, and kept walking. It wasn't a security call, at least not yet. It was one of those in-between moments where everyone waits for someone else to be the adult in the room. Naomi let the silence stand for a heartbeat, then another. She had seen what panic does to people and to systems. She had built her life's work on creating order where chaos wanted to intrude. This, she decided, was not a moment for explanations. Explanations would only feed the wrong story. Her voice, when it came, was calm enough to lower the temperature. "Linda," she said, "you have my documents. You have my seat. You have confirmation." "Yes, ma'am," Linda said, grateful to answer a question she could answer. "All clear." "Then please complete the scan," Naomi said. Linda's thumb hovered over the enter key. She could almost feel the press of it in her muscles. But she also felt the captain's presence as a kind of gravity. In customer service, you learn the topography of power, whose requests are preferences and whose are orders. The captain's requests were rarely requests. She withdrew her hand a fraction of an inch. "Captain?" she asked, a plea tucked into a title. Bob didn't move. He could have chosen grace there, could have said, "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." A softer man might have. But years of being deferred to had taught him a different reflex. He defaulted to control. "Ma'am," he said to Naomi, "I'm asking you to step aside while we verify a few things." "What things?" Naomi asked, not to be difficult, but to require precision. Systems, she knew, only improve when you demand specifics. Bob's eyes flicked to the backpack again. "For one, what you're carrying." "A laptop," she said, "and a presentation." His mouth made a small line. "Sometimes people conceal items. It's my responsibility to prevent that." A murmur ran through the line, the sound of polite people growing uncomfortable. Patrick steadied his phone. He didn't speak, but his face had the look of someone memorizing a transcript in real time. Naomi found herself thinking, absurdly, of the small kindnesses that make travel bearable. The boarding agent who makes eye contact, the barista who remembers to leave room for cream, the stranger who lifts a bag to the overhead without being asked. The world, at its best, ran on 1,000 private courtesies. But sometimes it didn't, and when it didn't, you had to decide whether to bend around the unfairness or to call for help. She chose. Without hurry, she slid her phone from the pocket of her hoodie. The small movement felt louder than it was. It drew eyes. It startled no one and yet reset the room. Bob gave a short, dismissive laugh, an old habit of telegraphing that he'd already won. "Going to call customer service?" he asked. "We'll be finished here long before they arrive." Naomi didn't answer him. She scrolled to a favorite contact, the way you might scroll to a family member, and pressed her thumb to dial. She lifted the phone to her ear and waited through the first ring, then the second. Her face didn't betray impatience or triumph. It registered only focus, the look of a person bringing order to a problem. Across the lane rope, the teenager with the headphones whispered, "Dude," to no one in particular. The young flight attendant took a half-step closer, curiosity winning over protocol. Linda held very still, as if motion might break a delicate truce. Ethan answered. Naomi didn't turn away, didn't seek privacy, didn't lower her voice. She allowed the words to fill only as much space as they needed. "Ethan," she said, "Code Red, Gate B23. The words Code Red hung in the air like an approaching storm, drawing curious glances from every corner of Gate B-23. The first-class lane froze. Not the whole airport. Nothing could truly stop that. But the thin slice of it around Naomi Brooks went still enough for people to hear themselves breathe. Linda Myers kept her hand near the enter key, as if proximity alone could count as progress. Captain Robert "Bob" Hensley stood planted between Naomi and the scanner, chin high, the way a man stands who has never doubted his right to stand anywhere. Naomi waited with the phone at her ear, listening to the brief hiss of a connected line and the steady voice that followed. She didn't pace, didn't step away for privacy, didn't soften her words to keep anyone comfortable. She simply did what needed doing. "Ethan," she said. "Code red, Gate B-23. A small pause. "Yes, you have 4 minutes." She ended the call and slid the phone back into her hoodie pocket. If she felt relief, she hid it. If she felt anger, she refused to feed it. She kept only the calm that comes from knowing the right doors will soon open. Bob exhaled through his nose, a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. 4 minutes, he repeated, as if tasting the number might make it ridiculous. "We'll be finished long before then." No one answered him. The silence did a strange thing. It offered people time to notice details. A toddler in a red knit cap pointed at the nose of the plane visible through the window and whispered, "Big." A businessman put away his headphones without taking his eyes off the scene. Patrick Lawson, the man with the tweed jacket and the lawyer's steady gaze, shifted his thumb to lock focus on his phone's camera. He didn't pan wildly or zoom. He framed the counter, the captain's stance, the young woman waiting with her backpack strap in the crook of her elbow. Subpoenas and trial exhibits often began with simple, careful rectangles like that. A faint crackle sounded from Linda's headset. She pressed the earpiece. "Copy," she murmured. The muscles along her jaw loosened, just a fraction, at whatever she heard. Then she looked up at Naomi and gave the tiniest nod a person can give and still call it a nod. "Ma'am," Bob said, sensing a signal and swatting at it. "Step to the side." Naomi didn't move. She wasn't aggressive about it. She simply held her place. The way you hold a space on a crowded subway when it is yours by right and by ticket. "My seat is 2A, she said, not for the first time and not as a debate. From the concourse behind, footsteps approached with the purposeful cadence of people who aren't guessing their way forward. Heads turned before the procession came into view, a small phalanx of suits and ID badges moving with a pace that chose its path and stuck to it. At the center was a tall man in a charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, tie knotted with the kind of precision that signals a practiced morning. He carried no briefcase and wore no expression of rush. He was exactly on time. "Good morning, Naomi," he said, and only then did he let his eyes shift to the captain. If names could lower a room's temperature, the way he said hers did it, not Miss Brooks with polite remove, not ma'am with wary distance. Naomi, as one speaks to a colleague trusted enough to hold the keys when you're away. Linda straightened instinctively. The two people flanking the man were the station manager, Tom Whitaker, face tight with worry, and a woman with the quiet, alert demeanor of someone who runs security without always needing a uniform. Behind them, a second pair from terminal operations halted 4 paces back, already measuring how to unblock a gate area without turning it into a spectacle. "Captain," the tall man said, extending a business card he didn't insist Bob take. "Ethan Cole, Chief Operating Officer, Sterling Innovations." Bob glanced at the card but didn't pick it up. "We're boarding a flight, Mr. Cole," he said, stressing "we" as if to remind everyone whose verb tense mattered here. "We have standards to maintain." Ethan nodded once, as if agreeing to a truth that had no bearing on the one ahead. "We do," he said, and his voice was calm in a way that made other voices sound like they'd been trying too hard. "And one of those standards is boarding valid passengers without harassment." "I'm exercising my authority," Bob replied. "If you'd like to discuss procedures, you can contact—" "I did," Ethan said. The interruption feather-light, almost courteous. "I contacted myself." A ripple of soft laughter moved through the waiting area, not mockery exactly, but the communal exhale when a puzzle piece clicks into place. Tom Whitaker swallowed hard. He'd been on calls with Ethan Cole. You didn't mistake that voice once you'd heard it. Ethan turned slightly so that, without raising his volume, he was addressing not just Bob, but anyone whose phone would later carry this moment to people who hadn't been there to see it. "Sterling Innovations," he said, "is the parent company that designed and manages the passenger flow, baggage handling, and ground logistics at this terminal. This terminal," he added, and he let his hand open in a motion that took in the glass, the gates, the polished floor under their feet, "is under our operating control through a majority stake in the consortium that runs it." He let that rest. Not long, just long enough for people to connect one fact to the next fact without having to be dragged. "And Ms. Brooks," he said, shifting his palm toward Naomi, not presenting her exactly, but acknowledging her the way you might acknowledge the source of a song everyone had been humming without knowing its name, "is our chief executive and principal owner." It didn't become noisy. That was the curious thing. The volume didn't spike. If anything, it dipped so the words could land. A few audible inhales, one soft "oh" that sounded more like a prayer than a gasp. Patrick's camera caught Linda's eyes flood with a relief so quick and so human you couldn't stage it if you tried. Bob's jaw didn't drop. He wasn't a man who unraveled all at once. He steadied himself with a small motion, fingers smoothing the brim of his hat on the counter, as if this were merely a conversation that had taken an unexpected turn. "Mr. Cole," he said, "ownership of a terminal doesn't override FAA authority in the cabin." "Nor does it need to," Ethan said. "The FAA didn't ask you to block a valid passenger from boarding, Captain. You chose to." A few phones shifted for a clearer angle. The security chief's gaze swept the perimeter, counting cameras as one counts exits, not with fear, but with logistics in mind. Bob glanced at Naomi's backpack again, reaching for the thread he'd decided would sew this shut. "We have to be cautious about what people carry onto the aircraft." "Then perhaps focus that caution," Ethan said mildly, "on what the ticket and the manifest say, not on what a hoodie suggests." Oh, and it wasn't a zinger. He didn't deliver it like one. He stated it, even-tempered, and it sat there with the weight of something obvious you regret not having considered sooner. Tom Whitaker found his voice. "Captain," he said, as if speaking from the far end of a tunnel where the words had to travel through his job to reach his mouth, "Ms. Brooks is cleared." The word "cleared" had never felt heavier. Linda's hand floated toward the scanner. Bob didn't move. Not a shove, not a step, just enough body and just enough space to keep a thing from happening. It was habit as much as intention. Naomi let her gaze settle on Tom first, then Linda, then the security chief, who gave a single, almost invisible nod. "You are seen. Say what you need to say." She looked back at Bob, and when she spoke, it was without anger and without tremor. It was the voice of a person who had chosen her words before she arrived. "Not today," she said. "Not ever again from my terminal. Get him off the bridge now." There are sentences that change the shape of a room. This one did. It didn't shout over anything. It simply rearranged where authority lived. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then authority found its channels. The security chief murmured, "Understood," into her shoulder mic. Two officers in plain clothes, clean lines, calm faces, stepped forward the way seasoned ushers step down an aisle when the house lights come up. They weren't there to make a scene. They were there to remove the possibility of one. Bob blinked once, slow, as if surfacing from a dream that hadn't yet decided whether to be pleasant or not. "Is this necessary?" he asked. It might have sounded dignified if it hadn't been so thin. "It is," Naomi said. 4 syllables, no heat. She wasn't collecting a debt. She was balancing a ledger. Tom opened his palm. "Captain, your ID," he said, and misery colored the formality. Please. Bob's hand hovered over his lanyard. He closed his fingers around the plastic badge and didn't lift it. Habit again. The small, stubborn pause before surrender. He looked past Tom to the jet bridge, as if it might argue for him, as if the airplane could vouch for his place the way it had for so many years. The airplane said nothing. Airplanes never do. "Sir," one of the officers said, gentle as a librarian, "we'll escort you through the service corridor." The word escort arrived with all its subtext intact. No handcuffs, no raised voices, but also no ambiguity. The path had narrowed to a single lane. Patrick's camera stayed steady. He didn't pan to the officers. He kept his frame on the counter and the man who had tried to be a wall. In later retellings, what people would remember wasn't the glimpse of badges, but the flatness of Bob's palm when he finally lifted his lanyard, the small plastic rectangle that had let every door swing for him until it didn't. He handed it over. "Thank you," Tom said. The words were polite because Americans are, at heart, terribly polite in public, even when the ground shifts. Tom stepped back. The officers stepped in, not touching, not crowding, just present on either side like parentheses around a sentence that had reached its period. Linda pressed enter. The scanner sang a soft, satisfied note. Brooks, Naomi, 2A, boarded. The little gate turned with a quiet click. Naomi dipped her head once toward Linda, a thanks without ceremony, and lifted her backpack strap higher on her shoulder. She did not look at Bob as she stepped forward. There is a grace in refusing to gloat that older people recognize and admire. It leaves dignity in the room for someone else to pick up later if they're wise enough. "Hold," Bob said, sudden, as if the word might rewind the tape. It landed nowhere. Ethan set the business card gently on the counter where Bob's hat had been, a polite place marker in a story that had, for the captain, run out of pages. He turned slightly to address the room, the way a pastor might turn toward a congregation at the close of a benediction. "Thank you for your patience," he said. "We'll move boarding along now." If anyone clapped, they kept it inside. What sounded instead was the soft chorus of shoulders releasing tension, the reset beep of the scanner, the normal airport noises returning as if someone had lifted a glass dome. The toddler in the red cap announced, "Plane," again, satisfied that the world made sense. Naomi paused at the mouth of the jet bridge and looked back, but not at Bob, who was already being guided toward a nondescript door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." She looked at Linda. "Thank you," Naomi said, and the gate agent's eyes flicked shiny for an instant, which she covered with a nod. Then Naomi stepped onto the jet bridge, its metal floor giving a tiny, familiar rattle underfoot, the way jet bridges always do, a sound so ordinary and reassuring that even people who don't like to fly find comfort in it. Behind her, Bob allowed himself to be guided away. He didn't protest, didn't plead. He set his jaw and looked straight ahead, walking a corridor he'd watched others walk and never imagined for himself. People made a path without being asked. Phones lifted, yes, but not as a mob, more like witness. The worst thing about the public square, he was learning, wasn't the noise. It was the accuracy. At the counter, Tom leaned in close to Ethan, voice low. "We'll get a relief, Captain." "You will," Ethan said, not unkind. "And you'll brief your CEO. Our legal team will be in touch this afternoon." Tom nodded. He looked like a man who had slept fine the night before and would not tonight. Patrick stopped recording. He didn't check the clip yet. He slid the phone into his pocket and pulled a small notebook from the inside of his jacket out of muscle memory. A lawyer's habit, capture impressions while they're still warm. He scribbled 3 sentences. Nothing fancy, just the bones. Captain blocks passenger despite valid first-class ticket. COO arrives. Terminal ownership. Passenger is CEO. Security escorts captain away. Boarding resumes. He closed the notebook and exhaled through his nose, the way people do when the world, for a fleeting minute, aligns with the rules printed on the posters. On the jet bridge, the hiss of conditioned air grew louder. Naomi reached the threshold where jet bridge meets airplane and paused for the briefest moment, the way you pause at a familiar doorway to take in the smell of home. The flight attendant at the door offered a gentle, "Welcome aboard," then recognized something in Naomi's face, authority without demand, dignity without display, and added a quiet, sincere, "It's good to have you." Naomi gave a small smile, the kind that says, "Let's get to work." Back at the gate, Linda wiped her palms on the sides of her blazer, the adrenaline finally draining. She resumed boarding with a care that looked almost reverent, as if each beep were a vow to do the next right thing. Near the counter, Bob's hat still rested where he'd placed it. Tom picked it up and held it for a beat, unsure whether to carry it or leave it or hand it to the security chief. The chief solved it for him with a nod toward a small gray bin labeled Personal Effects. Tom laid the hat inside. It fit neatly, like a fact. Naomi points at Bob. "Not today. Not ever again from my terminal. Get him off the bridge now." Two security officers step forward toward Bob as passengers lift their phones to record. The click of the jet bridge door echoed like a gavel, sealing Bob's fate as security led him away. The sound wasn't loud, not really, just the soft metal latch clack that happens 1,000 times a day at big airports. But for the handful of people who had watched the moment at Gate B-23, it felt final, like the end of a hearing where the verdict had been read. Boarding resumed. The scanner beeped its modest melody. People breathed again. Linda Myers steadied her hands and found her rhythm. "Welcome aboard. Enjoy your flight. Thank you." Each phrase settled the air a little. She'd worked this job long enough to know that courtesy is ballast. It keeps a wobbly moment from tipping the whole plane. On the jet bridge, Naomi walked the slight incline toward the aircraft door, the floor plates humming with that familiar hollow metallic note underfoot. At the threshold, a flight attendant in a navy dress met her with a small, genuine smile. "Good to have you," she said, and Naomi nodded, letting the simple kindness soak in. Seat 2A felt like quiet water after a choppy harbor. Naomi set her backpack beneath the ottoman, slid the phone into airplane mode, then out again. One more message before the door. She typed to Ethan. "Thank you. Keep it calm. Protect the staff who followed protocol. Document everything." She tapped send and exhaled. Back at the gate, Ethan Cole stood with the security chief and Tom Whitaker. He spoke in the tone of a person who takes heat out of a system just by naming the parts that are hot. "Tom, you'll need a relief captain. Call scheduling now. Tell them you have a terminal-level directive in play and a security removal. We'd like to minimize the delay." Tom nodded, phone already in his hand. He didn't argue. There are days when arguing is just a slower form of agreement. The security chief clicked her radio once and gave Ethan a short nod. "We'll take him through the service corridor, Mr. Cole, discreetly." "Thank you, Chief," Ethan said. He turned to Linda. "Ms. Myers." She startled slightly at the formality. "Yes, sir?" "You followed protocol," he said. "Please continue doing exactly that." It wasn't flowery, but it landed like a hand on the shoulder. Linda felt something in her chest loosen. Across the aisle rope, a man in a tweed jacket closed his recording app and lifted his head. Patrick Lawson didn't post it yet. Years in court had taught him that the first draft of outrage can trip on its own shoelaces. He opened notes and typed a single line. "Pilot blocks valid first-class passenger. COO arrives, reveals terminal ownership. Security escorts pilot. Boarding resumes." He read it once, nodded to himself, and only then uploaded the 30-something seconds of calm, steady video, paired with a caption that used no insults and no adjectives beyond public, documented, and undeniable. Phones in the line began vibrating softly, the little ripples of a pebble tossed into a big pond. They took Bob along the back spine of Terminal 4, where the public doesn't walk. Service doors. Gray paint. The utilitarian smell of industrial cleaner that never quite leaves. His steps were even, but his face looked like a man walking on glass he couldn't see. The officers flanking him didn't crowd. They just existed on either side, a steady set of parentheses. One flight attendant coming off a commute leg saw him coming and stepped aside without being told. She didn't gloat. She didn't look away either. She held that quiet, conflicted look that workers get when the uniform they respect is worn by someone who has forgotten how to honor it. They reached a small conference room, the kind that tries not to be depressing with a potted plant in the corner and a poster reminding employees about wellness resources. Someone had already set a plastic bin on the table. Personal effects. Bob's hat sat inside like a relic. A woman from HR, gray cardigan, calm voice, met him there. "Captain Hensley," she said, "you're on paid hold pending review. Please hand your ID to Mr. Whitaker." He had already done that. She nodded as if checking a box. "Someone from the union will join you shortly. We'll arrange a car to take you home." Bob tried to summon the tone that had gotten him through 100 uncomfortable exchanges, the polished, neutral insistence of a man whose job relies on moving things forward. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said. "We'll document everything," she replied with a professional kindness that suggested she'd heard the word misunderstanding in this room before. "The sooner we begin, the better." He sat. The chair did not feel like it fit a captain. At B-23, boarding flowed again. Patrick's post jumped across a few hundred screens, then a few thousand. Someone in line added a second angle. The scanner, the beeping confirmation, the captain's body positioning. The clips were brief, not dramatic. That's why they felt so persuasive. No shouting, no shoving. Just a line that shouldn't have been there and a woman who knew how to remove it without raising her voice. "Hat are flying," while black appeared. It wasn't new. It never is. But it felt freshly sharpened by timestamps and gate numbers and the unshowy way the moment had unfolded. Soon another tag spun up, smaller and meaner. "Hat Orion Shame." Social media does like its labels tidy. A gate away, 2 ground crew employees leaned over a tablet and watched the clip on a lunch break that had just become less restful. One of them rubbed his jaw. "That's the COO, right?" he asked. The other nodded. "Yep. And that woman, did you hear? That's the boss's boss's boss." They didn't say good or bad. They just went quiet the way people do when something obvious finally happens and you're realizing how many times it didn't. In Chicago, the floor-to-ceiling windows of Orion Atlantic's headquarters looked out over a strip of lake that liked to pretend it was an ocean. The CEO's office was tidy, not ostentatious. James Rutherford liked his desk clean. He liked his emails answered. He did not like his phone lit up like a Christmas tree at mid-morning with lawyers, PR, operations, and a board member whose patience was measured in dollars instead of minutes. "Bring me the first clip," he said, and the head of PR airdropped the video to the big screen. They watched in silence. James pinched the bridge of his nose when he saw the blocking stance. He'd been in this business long enough to know when a situation turned from fixable to "you will wear this for a while." "Draft the statement," he said. "The standard one?" PR asked, already typing. "We are investigating. This does not reflect our values." James looked up. "Hold it for 30 minutes. I want to know exactly who she is." That answer arrived in 9. The chief of staff slid in with a printed one-pager and a face that had lost its color. "Sir, Ms. Brooks Naomi. She's the CEO of Sterling Innovations." "I know Sterling Innovations," James said. "They're our vendor." "They're our vendor," the chief of staff said carefully. "And through a holding entity, they hold the majority stake in the consortium that operates Terminal 4. That took 2 seconds to sink in. James sat back. He stared out at the stubborn blue of Lake Michigan and didn't see it. When he turned back, his voice had the thin steadiness of a man walking a rope. "No standard statement," he said. "We apologize, we suspend, and we make contact directly. I want eyes on Captain Hensley's file in 10 minutes. HR, union, legal, all of it." "Understood." "Then get me a number for Ethan Cole," James added. "I suspect my afternoon will be educational." The last of first class boarded. Naomi buckled her belt while the pre-departure routine clicked into place around her. The purser came by with a pre-flight greeting, measured but warm. "If there's anything you need, Miss Brooks." "Thank you," Naomi said. "Keep it on schedule if you can, and be kind to the folks at the gate. Today's harder on them than it looks." "Yes, ma'am." Naomi glanced at her phone one last time before airplane mode. 3 messages stacked themselves in quick succession. Ethan, relief captain in progress. Tom Whitaker cooperating. Security report filed. HR has Bob in a room with Union. Then, legal. Will memorialize the incident in a letter to Orion. Recommend neutral language, strict asks. And finally, operations. Zurich briefing materials loaded. Odyssey is fueled if you choose to shift. She typed back, "Stay commercial. We don't need drama. We need precedent. Document, not perform." Then the little airplane slid onto the corner of the screen, and the ground fell away from the glass. She closed her eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to let her heartbeat step down a rung. When she opened them, the city was a quilt of rectangles spreading to water, and the plane tilted toward the gray-blue distance. Union reps move quickly when a storm breaks over one of their own. George Collins knocked on the conference room door where Bob waited, then slipped inside, tie loosened, face steady. "Al," he said, taking the chair beside him, "tell me exactly what happened. Don't dress it, just the sequence." Bob recited it more cleanly than he expected. When a pilot has lived by checklists, even a bad day can be read out like one. Boarding, hoodie, first class. A system that can be wrong. Authority, security risk. The words sounded worse in this room than they had out there. George didn't interrupt. He took notes in the block letters of a man whose handwriting had been legible to flight engineers 30 years ago, and still was. When Bob finished, George clicked his pen once. "Okay," he said, not unkindly. "Here's what we're up against. There's video. 2 angles, maybe 3 by now. It's clean. No raised voices, which means the optics are clear." Bob rubbed the heel of his hand along his jaw. "I was enforcing standards." George didn't bite. "What you were enforcing," he said gently, "was your judgment of a person who met the standard. The company will see it that way. The public already does." Bob leaned back, chair creaking faintly. The ceiling tile above the fluorescent light had a small stain on it shaped like an island he could not name. "What now?" "They'll send you home on hold," George said. "Then HR opens a formal review. I'll be with you. Don't talk to press. Don't post. Don't explain to anyone who isn't me or counsel. We'll see what's in your file. We'll see if there's a lane to keep you employed in some capacity while this cools." He hesitated, then added, "I need you to know. The company may decide they can't carry this." 30 years, Bob said. It wasn't anger. It was arithmetic. George nodded once. 30 years, he said softly. By late afternoon, Patrick's post had done what steady posts do. It made its way, not because of fireworks, but because of friction. Local news desks called the airport. Bloggers called Orion. A frequent flyer forum broke down the gate view, with a zeal once reserved for touchdown catches. "Look at the agent's scanner. Green means go," wrote one. "He physically blocked her," wrote another. "That's not captain's authority. That's a man in the wrong spot." The first official words came from Orion at 3:37 p.m. Eastern. "We are aware of a disturbing incident at JFK Terminal 4. The pilot involved has been removed from duty pending termination proceedings. We apologize to the passenger and to all who witnessed the event." Discrimination has no place at Orion Atlantic. It was blunt, unadorned, uncharacteristically quick. A minute later, a second, quieter message pinged to the inboxes of 3 people: Ethan, Naomi's chief of staff, and Sterling's general counsel. It came from James Rutherford himself, requesting a call at your earliest convenience. We intend to cooperate fully and to address systemic issues, not just the incident. Ethan read it, then typed a reply that was cordial but clear. "We'll speak in the morning. Please compile Captain Hensley's record, including prior complaints and the full gate footage. We'll propose corrective measures and oversight. In the meantime, protect the frontline staff who followed procedure." He added a line that felt important to say out loud: "No public theater. Real change. Dusk brushed its first violet across Greenwich by the time the company car rolled up to the Hensley driveway. The house had that careful look of suburban prosperity. Boxwoods trimmed tight, 2 tall planters by the door, a discreet brass plaque with the house number polished by a hand that liked to polish things. Bob stepped out with a little stiffness that had nothing to do with age. He paused under the porch light, as if a second at the threshold might make what was inside easier. He opened the door. The house smelled faintly of lilies and lemon polish. Maggie was in the foyer, arranging white blooms in a glass cylinder taller than her forearm. She wore a sweater the color of clean oatmeal and a strand of pearls that had belonged to her mother. It should have been a pleasant picture. It felt like a painting hung slightly crooked. "You're home early," she said without turning. Her voice carried the lightness of someone keeping conversation afloat out of habit. "The flight changed," he said, and the pause in the middle wasn't for drama. It was because the word ended felt too close to true. She slid one stem into the cluster, stepped back, and eyed the balance. "Oh?" she asked. Then the sound buzzed, a little insect of a notification, and she glanced at her phone. He watched it happen. He would remember it much later with almost photographic clarity. The tiny tightening at the corners of her mouth as her eyes scanned, the way her chin lifted half an inch, as if distance might soften the impact, the small inhale that didn't make it all the way to her shoulders. Her thumb tapped. The video filled the screen. There he was, in miniature, bracketed by a counter and a line rope, neat as a diorama. There was the young woman in the gray hoodie, the gate agent, the man in the charcoal suit. And there was the moment. Him in the wrong place. Authority used as a bridge where there should have been a door. The lily's scent turned sharp in the quiet. Maggie's eyes stayed on the screen through the end, through the single-sentence caption, through the swelling numbers at the bottom that he didn't want to read. When she finally lifted her gaze, what had been concern only minutes before had drained away, replaced by a clarity that felt colder than anger. She set the phone down on the marble entry table beside the flowers, very carefully, as if dropping it might shatter something expensive. Her expression shifted from concern to contempt, the distance between them suddenly as wide as a runway. She looked at him for a long beat. "You monumental fool," she whispered, and the words were as gentle as a surgeon's cut. The phone buzzed again on the marble. Another notification, louder somehow in the quiet house, while Bob stood in the foyer, realizing the worst part had not yet arrived. The early morning light spilled over the Hudson like melted gold, warming the glass towers of Manhattan and tracing soft lines along the quiet streets below. Naomi's flight to Zurich had landed hours earlier, but the ripple of what happened at Gate B-23 still traveled across New York, across the country even, like a story whispered from one table to the next in a neighborhood diner. News clips replayed the confrontation. Social media posts captured Naomi's calm voice, the sharp edge in Ethan's tone, and the look on Bob's face when the truth was revealed. In the days following, the city's papers ran editorials about systemic bias in air travel. Television panels debated professionalism, corporate culture, and the weight of perception. The hashtags weren't explosive. They were steady, persistent, like a drumbeat you couldn't ignore. Naomi had chosen silence for now, not out of retreat, but to give the right voices space. She believed in letting the facts stand without rushing to control the narrative. The truth, she knew, didn't need to shout if it was carried by enough people who cared. In Zurich, she moved through her business meetings with practiced composure. The boardroom windows looked out over the lake, calm and blue beneath the alpine peaks. Executives tried to treat her as just another partner in a strategic alliance, but the glances they exchanged betrayed that they'd seen the footage. A few even mentioned it carefully, like testing the water before stepping in. Naomi responded with the same warmth she'd give to anyone, warmth laced with a reminder that respect should not depend on what you know about someone's title. Back in New York, Ethan was working long hours in the Orion Atlantic offices. The CEO had called an emergency leadership meeting, and the tension in the room was thick enough to cut. James Rutherford sat at the head of the table, suit perfect, jaw tight, as he laid out the facts. Complaints from passengers and staff were already being reviewed by a third-party panel. Policy overhauls were on the table. Ethan kept his voice even but firm, emphasizing that cosmetic fixes wouldn't be enough. The company needed structural change. For Bob, the days had a different texture. He no longer had the uniform or the authority of his gate agent badge. In its place was a hollow sort of quiet, one that settled in the apartment when the phone didn't ring, when the blinds stayed drawn until noon. Friends he thought would defend him stayed away, unsure what to say. Even his sister's calls were less frequent, though she always asked if he'd eaten, always told him she was praying for him. The first time he saw the news replay of Naomi's calm expression as Ethan announced her title, something twisted in his chest, a mix of shame and a reluctant recognition that she had carried herself with more grace than he had ever managed on his best day. Naomi's team, meanwhile, was already drafting proposals. They envisioned a scholarship program for underrepresented youth who wanted to become pilots, mechanics, or air traffic controllers. They wanted training that wasn't just a checkbox, but an experience, immersive, personal, impossible to forget. Ethan knew there would be pushback from some executives who feared the cost or the optics, but he also knew Naomi's quiet persistence could move mountains. One evening, Naomi called Ethan from her hotel in Zurich. The light from the bedside lamp softened the lines of travel fatigue on her face. "How's the temperature back there?" she asked. "Warming in some places," Ethan said. "Still icy in others. Rutherford's thinking. That's something." Naomi smiled faintly. "Thinking is the first step. Acting is the one that counts." "You've got allies now," Ethan said. "More than you think." She nodded. "It's not about me. It's about making sure the next Maya James doesn't have to fight to get to her gate." That night, Ethan stayed late in his office, the city's lights flickering against the glass. Outside, winter was giving way to spring, and he wondered if change inside these walls could move with the same inevitability. Back in Bob's small apartment, he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm. The muted TV played a segment about Orion Atlantic's upcoming diversity initiative. For the first time, Bob didn't reach for the remote. He watched Naomi's face on the screen and felt the faintest pull toward something unfamiliar. Not resentment, but the desire to understand. By the end of that week, the first draft of Naomi's reform proposal was ready. Ethan sent it to Rutherford with a short message. "This is our chance to get it right." The reply came faster than expected. "Let's talk." In Zurich, Naomi stood by the hotel window, looking down at the tram tracks gleaming under the street lamps. Somewhere across the ocean, wheels had started to turn. It was too soon to call it victory, but it was movement. And movement, she knew, was how you reached the gate, one steady step after another. 1 year later, a new generation of pilots walked through JFK's Terminal 4, uniforms crisp, faces as diverse as the passengers they served. The light in the concourse had that clean, high-ceiling brightness particular to big airports on a good day. The terrazzo floors held 100 moving reflections. Announcements chimed the way church bells might in another century, predictable, reassuring, each one pointing travelers toward where they needed to be. And right in the center of it all, on a plinth of brushed steel and walnut, a new digital installation pulsed to life with slow, elegant transitions. Faces of ramp crews and cleaners, software engineers and agents, pilots and flight attendants, then flight maps and on-time metrics, then a simple quote that lingered between cycles long enough to read twice. "This place belongs to everyone. The journey is for all." Naomi Brooks. She stood a few paces back from the crowd with Ethan Cole at her side, letting the moment belong to the people gathered around it. Some had come on their break in orange vests and scuffed work boots, still smelling faintly of jet fuel. Others stood in neatly pressed uniforms, lanyards straight, shoes mirror-polished. Linda Myers, in a tailored navy blazer she wouldn't have trusted herself to wear a year ago, watched the display with her hands clasped lightly in front of her. Station supervisor now, nameplate new enough to shine. A local news crew had set up down the concourse, careful not to block traffic. The reporter rehearsed lines softly into a dead mic, a partnership between Sterling Innovations and Orion Atlantic, the Sterling Skies Initiative, first cohort of scholarship pilots graduating this month. A handful of the cadets stood together near the railing, trying to look composed and mostly failing at it, nerves showing through smiles as young as the sunrise. One of them, a black woman with neatly braided hair and a posture that telegraphed a lifetime of standing tall even when she hadn't felt it, adjusted her tie and took a slow breath. "Ready?" Naomi asked, low, to no one in particular. "As we'll ever be," Ethan said. He had aged a little in the last year. Not badly, just visibly, the way people do when they have lived with responsibility and chosen not to let it make them unkind. They had come by the long road, not the loud one. After the day at B-23, Orion Atlantic had agreed to nearly everything Sterling's team put forward. Nearly. The one holdout had been the piece Naomi cared about most: formal, binding compensation links between executive bonuses and measurable improvements in equity and passenger satisfaction by demographic. James Rutherford had wanted good faith. Naomi had wanted teeth. The bargaining had lasted into 2 time zones and through half a dozen drafts. In the end, the contract language was as dry as a cracker and just as crisp. Bonuses tied to benchmarks, blind review panels for complaints against senior staff, immersive training that didn't rely on PowerPoint but asked people to look through someone else's eyes, and most important to Naomi, a permanent joint oversight committee with equal seats for frontline workers. No hashtags announced it, no victory laps, just signatures and implementation, then month-by-month reports posted where anyone could read them, including the staff whose shifts made the numbers move. Now the payoff was walking toward the camera. The news producer raised a hand, counting down with fingers. 3, 2, 1. The red tally light flared. "We're live at JFK's Terminal 4, the reporter began, her voice tuned to noon news, friendly, clear, a little bit proud of a good story. Behind me, Sterling Innovations and Orion Atlantic are unveiling the Sterling Skies display and celebrating the first graduates of a new program bringing underrepresented young people into aviation careers." She turned slightly. "This is Maya James," she said, offering the mic. "Maya, you grew up in the Bronx. Did you ever imagine you'd be here, in uniform, about to start flight training?" Maya's eyes flicked once in the direction of Naomi and Ethan, as if borrowing a bit of their balance, then she found her own. "My mom took me to LaGuardia when I was 8 to watch planes take off," she said. "I used to think the sky had a lock on it, like it was only for certain people. Miss Brooks and this program didn't just give me a key, they took the lock off." There was a little ripple of sound behind the camera, soft chuckles. Someone's quiet, "That's right." The reporter smiled, honest and uncoached. "Congratulations," she said, and meant it. Between live hits, the camera's red light winked off, and the crowd settled into regular airport sound again. Naomi stepped forward only when invited, kept her remarks brief, and spent more time shaking hands than speaking into microphones. She asked ground crew about their kids. She thanked the custodial team by name. She told Linda Myers, "I kept your note." And when Linda blinked in confusion, Naomi added, "The one you wrote to yourself the night you got home that said you did right today. Don't worry, you weren't the only one who needed to read it." Linda laughed once, surprised at being read so cleanly. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing us." "That's the work," Naomi said simply. In a dispatch office outside Omaha, Nebraska, the air smelled of coffee that had been hot 3 hours ago and paper that had been stacked for longer. The walls were mostly maps, corridor routes, delivery windows, fuel stops, and a whiteboard with a week's worth of deadlines marching across it in neat lines. Truck icons blinked on a monitor like fireflies caught inside a jar. It was just after 10 in the morning local time, but the sun outside had already flattened into the harsh white of a Midwest summer. At desk 7, a man in a faded cardigan leaned back and let the office chair's tired hydraulics push up against him. His gray stubble had won the argument with his razor a few days back. The name on his ID badge read R. Hensley in condensed sans serif. The TV in the corner played low, as it always did. Market tickers, a weather graphic in the bottom right, a crawl of headlines sliding past like loose leaf pages on a breeze. Ordinarily, he didn't pay attention. Today the anchor's voice cut through, something about JFK Terminal 4, something about a new program for pilot candidates, something about an installation with faces he recognized not as individuals, but as a class of people he had once only noticed when they weren't there. He looked up. The camera framed the concourse, the display, and a small knot of young people in uniforms they would grow into. The quote appeared and lingered. "This place belongs to everyone. The journey is for all." Then a close-up of the donor wall at the base of the display, names etched into brushed metal. Sterling Innovations, Orion Atlantic, employees of Terminal 4, and in a smaller panel, in gratitude to those who keep the doors open and the lines moving. He'd learned not to bark at TVs. The instinct had burned out in him somewhere between the HR interview and the second job rejection form. But the sight of that line, "Keep the doors open," did something steady and painful in his chest. The old reflex rose once more, tried to blame the world for having changed under his feet. Then it ebbed. What remained wasn't heat, it was weight. He took a paper cup from the stack by the machine and filled it halfway. The coffee steamed, then cooled, as coffee does, indifferent to what a man thinks while it does it. He returned to the desk and sat. On the screen, a young cadet, Maya, spoke, and when she said the sky had felt locked, he remembered a little girl who'd once asked in a sweet, high voice why the lady at the gate couldn't get on the plane. He had not answered her. He had spoken over her head to keep a line from moving where it should, and the world had heard him do it. There had been consequences for that, public, financial, domestic. He'd told himself, in the first months after, that he didn't deserve how much of a meal the world had made of his mistake. In the months after those months, he told himself fewer stories. He started writing in the evenings instead. Nothing literary, just things he didn't want to forget. A man will sometimes try truth when he has run out of alibis. He picked up a pen from the chipped holder by his keyboard, the kind with the bank's logo half worn from too many thumbs, and scribbled 3 words on the margin of a printed route. "I was wrong." Then, because 3 words can stand up straighter if you give them context, he wrote a 4th. "Completely." A coworker, 20 years his junior and a head taller when he stood, wandered by with a stack of manila folders and a grin that managed to be kind without being pitying. "You see the piece?" he asked. "About the pilot kids?" "I saw," Bob said. "Pretty cool," the coworker offered. "It is," Bob said. The words surprised him by how true they felt. "It is." He turned his attention back to the blinking freight map and toggled a lane to green. The work was honest. It didn't ask him to be important. It only asked him to be decent. Back in New York, the unveiling wound down without ceremony. People had jobs to get back to, flights to board, lunches to finish. Naomi preferred it that way. Movements, she believed, should be legible to the people who make them happen. The rest of the world could catch up when it was ready. James Rutherford found her at the edge of the concourse as the crowd thinned. He had come without an entourage. His suit was good, his tie the right shade of nothing, his expression properly humble for the occasion. They had learned how to work together. Adversaries by necessity turned colleagues by choice. He had kept his side of the bargain. He looked tired, too, in a way that suggested he'd spent some of his capital doing it. "Ms. Brooks," he said. "James," she answered, and the exchange felt less like ice thawing and more like 2 people acknowledging that the river under it had kept moving all along. "Benchmarks look good," he said, not crowing, not apologizing. "Not perfect. Better." "Better holds," she said. "Better builds." He nodded toward the display. The oversight committee, front-line seats, turned out to be the smartest part, he admitted. Hard to argue with a baggage lead who can show you on video why a policy doesn't work. "That's why they're there," Naomi said. "When people closest to the problem speak, the solution tends to arrive on time." He half smiled at the airline pun and didn't press his luck for another. "You were right about the bonuses," he added. "It changed behavior, not just meetings, decisions." "I don't need to be right," Naomi said, and she meant it. "I need it to work." They stood for a moment, watching a father lift his daughter so she could see herself in the collage of faces on the screen. The little girl touched the glass with 2 fingers and giggled at the way it made her reflection go wavy. James cleared his throat. "How's Linda?" he asked. "Good," Naomi said. "Promoted, earned. She kept her head when the room lost its temperature. That's leadership." "I'm glad," he said. "Some days I think the only right people are the ones who never wanted to be in charge in the first place." "Then give them a reason to take the job anyway," Naomi said. "And a way to give it back if they stop listening." He laughed once softly. "Fair." He extended a hand. She shook it. Neither of them held on too long. When he walked away, Ethan slid into the space he'd left, a cup of coffee appearing as if by magic. "You'll want this before you pretend to like the lemon cookies at the staff reception," he said. "I like the lemon cookies," she protested. "You like the idea of liking them," he said. "Different thing." She took the coffee and let it warm her hands. "Maya did well," she said. "She did," Ethan said. "So did you." Naomi watched a ramp supervisor in a neon vest stop in front of the display just long enough to see his own photo appear, grinning, greasy from a long shift, beautiful for it. He nudged the coworker beside him. "There I am." This is how places change, she thought. Not in a single afternoon, but in the daily accumulation of 1,000 small recognitions. A woman in a soft purple cardigan approached, tentative smile, a paper program clutched in her hands. "Miss Brooks?" "Yes," Naomi said, stepping toward her. "I just wanted to say," the woman began, voice already thickening, "my granddaughter is in that class. She didn't think she'd ever be allowed to want this. You—" She stopped, embarrassed by her own tears. "Thank you." Naomi didn't do speeches for this part. She just hugged the grandmother lightly and said, "We're glad you're here." They stood like that for a heartbeat and then let go, both of them a little steadier. In Omaha, Bob set down his pen after writing, "I was wrong," completely. And in New York, Maya lifted her eyes to the camera and said, "The sky was never off limits." Between those 2 sentences, the story that had begun at Gate B23 finally found its balance. The afternoon stretched forward into ordinary hours, the best kind. Pilots walked to their gates. Agents printed new boarding passes for harried travelers who had missed connections. A janitor steered his machine in slow arcs around islands of feet, leaving a wet shine that would dry to mirror. The display glowed and shifted. People paused, saw themselves, and kept moving. Naomi and Ethan drifted toward the staff reception where, yes, lemon cookies waited on a tray beside coffee that would always be too strong or too weak depending on who poured it. She took one, bit in, and smiled at Ethan over the rim of a paper cup. "Not bad," she said. "Not good," he said. "Good enough," she answered. And he let her have the last word because, really, she'd earned it. Outside, a 787 lifted cleanly into the afternoon, the wing flexing like a bird's at the top of its beat. Inside, the little world of Terminal 4 did what good worlds do. It made room. And somewhere in Nebraska, a man who had once mistaken authority for virtue watched the screen a moment longer, then turned back to his map, picked up the phone, and said into the receiver, in a voice that contained more humility than it used to, "Let's get you where you're going." He meant it. The last scene at JFK had long since slipped from the front page, replaced by newer stories and fresh controversies. But for those who had been there that morning, or for members of the Black community who watched the video replay, its quiet power lingered. People remembered the steady voice of Naomi Brooks, the calm way she carried herself, and the unmistakable truth that respect was owed before titles were revealed. It wasn't a victory marked by fanfare. It was the kind that lived quietly in people's hearts, shifting how they saw the world. Naomi returned to her work in Zurich with the same focus she'd always had, but the seeds planted that day began to grow. Agreements were signed for scholarship programs, leadership training, and new policies that would give opportunity to those historically overlooked, especially within the Black community. She never branded these reforms as her personal answer to that morning at the gate. She didn't need to. Those who understood the deeper meaning recognized it instantly. Ethan, back in New York, saw firsthand how change could take root if you gave it care and time. There were meetings that stretched late into the night, and debates that tested patience, but also small wins. Like a young trainee pilot, the first in her family to enter aviation, writing a thank you letter to Orion Atlantic. In those moments, he thought back to Naomi's words, "Acting is the step that counts." Bob Hensley's life shifted onto a quieter path. He never returned to his former post, but he found work at a regional airfield far from the bustle of JFK. On evenings when the hangars stood silent, he'd remember that day, not the humiliation, but the way Naomi never once spoke of him in anger. She had protected her dignity without stripping his, a choice he would think about long after the noise faded. For Linda Myers, the gate agent, the unsigned note, "You did right," still hung in her hallway. Each morning she passed it, she felt the quiet weight of that day's lesson, that standing by the rules and by simple fairness matters most when it's tested. In the end, what stayed with all of them was not only the surprise that Naomi owned the terminal, it was the reminder that a person's worth cannot be read on their ticket, their clothing, or the color of their skin. The Black community, and indeed all communities, know too well the harm of being judged by surface alone. For those listening now, the lesson is simple yet enduring. Never let someone else's narrow vision define the space you take in the world. Like a lamp glowing in a dark window, a quiet act of courage can light the way through the narrowest judgments, guiding us into a wider, kinder light. If this story has touched you, share it forward, not for the drama, but for the hope it carries.